The observation deck of the frontier's edge had always been Lysa's sanctuary. She floated there most evenings, watching the swirl of distant nebulae paint the darkness in shades of violet and gold. But tonight, something was wrong. The cubs were drifting. Lisa pressed her palm against the transparent aluminum viewport, her breath fogging the surface. Behind her, in the station's zero-gravity nursery, 3 Velkan cubs, each no larger than a human infant, tumbled slowly through the air. Their 6 limbs splayed in confusion. Their caretaker, Tiv, a Velkan with deep azure fur and concerned amber eyes, made a series of clicks that the translator rendered as distress. "They won't respond to gravitational anchoring," Tiv said, his voice tight with worry. "It's as if they've forgotten how to orient themselves." Lisa turned from the viewport, her ponytail floating like a dark comet behind her head. She'd been the station's chief xenobiologist for 3 years, ever since humanity had been granted provisional membership in the Galactic Congregation. The Velkans had been their first true allies, a species that saw promise in humanity's chaotic creativity rather than threat. "Show me their vitals," Lysa said, pushing off the wall with practiced ease. Tiv's manipulator appendages danced across a holographic display. Heart rates elevated, stress hormones increasing. But physically, they're unharmed. "It's psychological, I think. They're experiencing existential displacement." Lysa studied the readouts, then looked back at the cubs. The youngest one, barely 2 weeks old, had begun to whimper a sound that translated across species as pure, helpless fear. Its siblings huddled close. But in zero gravity, even huddling became a slow-motion ballet of confusion. "Existential displacement," Lysa repeated. "They don't know which way is up anymore." Actor. "Exactly." Tiv's ear analogs flattened against his skull. "We've consulted every xenopsychologist on the station. The cubs need gravitational reference points to develop properly. Without them, their spatial cognition will never mature. They'll be broken." Lisa had seen this before, though never with living beings. Even human colonists on low-gravity worlds sometimes developed a condition called directional aphasia, the terrifying inability to distinguish up from down, forward from back. But these were children. Alien children, yes, but children nonetheless. "The artificial gravity generators," Lysa began. "Failed 3 hours ago," Tiv interrupted. "Maintenance says it'll be 48 hours minimum. The cubs won't last that long. Already their neural pathways are beginning to misfire." In human terms, imagine an infant's brain unable to process any sensory input correctly. It would be I'm catastrophic. Lysa finished. She floated closer to the cubs, extending a hand slowly. The smallest one drifted toward her, its 6 tiny paws reaching out instinctively. When it touched her palm, it immediately curled around her hand, clinging with desperate strength, and something clicked in Lysa's mind. "Tiv, do Velkan cubs develop their gravitational sense through physical contact with their mothers?" Tiv's eyes widened. "Yes. The mother's mass, her movement through 3-dimensional space, teaches them orientation. But in zero gravity, there's no mass-based reference," Lysa said, her thoughts racing. "No way for them to learn which way is down because down doesn't exist." "Correct. And I cannot provide that reference. My species evolved to sense gravitational fields directly. We're disoriented without them too. Just better at compensating." Lysa looked at the cub clinging to her hand. It had stopped whimpering. Its breathing slowed. "Humans didn't evolve with that sense," she said quietly. "We learned to create our own reference points, to make up our own, down wherever we went." She pulled herself to the center of the nursery, gathering the 3 cubs carefully. They clung to her jumpsuit, her arms, her shoulders. Tiv watched, confused. "What are you doing?" "Something humans are particularly good at," Lysa said. Improvising. She began to move. Not randomly, but with purpose. She pushed off one wall at a consistent velocity, rotated as she crossed the chamber, caught herself on the opposite wall with precise timing. Then, she repeated the pattern. Over and over. She traced the same path through three-dimensional space. A figure eight that brought her past the same points at the same angles. The cubs, pressed against her, felt every movement, every rotation, every acceleration and deceleration. You're creating a pattern, Teve breathed. An artificial rhythm. Humans didn't have gravitational senses either, Lysa said, her voice steady despite the exertion. We had heartbeats, breathing, walking, rhythms. Our mother's movements as they carried us. We learned up and down through repetition and pattern. She continued her dance through zero gravity, her movements becoming more elaborate. She added spins, calculated tumbles, always returning to the same orientation at the same points in space. The cubs began to chirp softly, not in distress, but in something that sounded almost like recognition. Hours passed. Teve brought her water through a straw. Other station personnel gathered at the nursery windows, watching the human woman and three alien infants perform their orbital ballet. Lysa's muscles screamed. Sweat beaded on her forehead, breaking free to form tiny floating spheres. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because the cubs had begun to move on their own. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, they released their grip on Lysa. They pushed off her body at the right moments, rotated with purpose, returned to her at predictable intervals. They were learning. Not down, there was no down, but pattern. Sequence. Predictable, cause and effect, in 3 dimensions. They were learning to navigate by rhythm instead of gravity. When the artificial gravity generators hummed back to life 18 hours later, the cubs barely noticed. They had already learned to swim through space itself, guided not by the pull of mass, but by the patterns of movement Lysa had taught them. Teve approached her as she finally allowed herself to rest. Magnetic boots, anchoring her to the deck. The cubs played nearby, now perfectly at ease, in the restored gravity. I don't understand, he said. You gave them something my people couldn't. But you're not Velkan. How did you know what they needed? Lysa smiled, exhausted but triumphant. Because we're human. We've been making up our own sense of direction since we first looked at the stars and decided they weren't unreachable. We walked into every impossible place and made it home. She watched the cubs tumble over each other, fully oriented now, fully alive. Sometimes, she continued, the most useful thing about humans isn't what we evolved to do. It's what we learned to do, when evolution wasn't enough. Teve's amber eyes glowed with something that might have been respect. Your species has a saying. I believe. Humanity. Fuck yeah. Lysa laughed, a sound of pure relief. Yeah. Something like that. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their eternal dance. And inside, 3 cubs, who should have been lost forever, played in gravity they'd learned to understand through the heartbeat rhythms of a human who refused to let them drift away.